Well, good morning, everyone. Buenos dias a todos. My name is Dante Villarreal, and I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President for Business and Talent Development here at your Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the Chamber, I am both excited and thankful you chose to dedicate an hour of your day to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by former New York Governor David Paterson. For those who are unfamiliar, here's a little background on Governor Paterson. David is both the first legally blind African-American individual to serve as governor of New York. He served in this position from 2008 to 2010, assuming governorship following the resignation of Governor Eliot Spitzer. We are looking forward to learning how Governor Paterson overcame racism and ableism throughout his career. In recognition of National Disability Employment Awareness Month, Governor Paterson will also speak to the importance of celebrating the many and varied contributions of people with disabilities in the workplace. Before I introduce Governor Paterson, I would like to recognize the sponsors who make today's program possible. Our event underwriters are Amway and Spectrum Health. Our lead supporters, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan and Consumers Energy. Our executive sponsors, Dematic, DTE Energy, Grand Rapids Business Journal, Grand Valley State University, Hayworth, Mercy Health, and OST. And of course, our technology sponsor, Switch. Our chamber champions are AHC Hospitality, Grand Rapids Community Foundation, HAP, HAP, Lake Michigan Credit Union, Mercantile Bank of Michigan, Spartan Nash, University of Michigan Health West, and Warner Norcross and Judd. Please join me in a warm round of virtual applause for our sponsors. Again, without them, these programs do not take place. As a friendly reminder, here are a few tips and tricks to maximize your virtual experience today. And yes, for some of us, we're getting back into the virtual. You will have the opportunity to submit questions throughout Governor Paterson's presentation using the chat function. He will address as many as time allows during the moderated Q&A session following his presentation. The chat can also be utilized to engage with one another. If you hear something that resonates with you, send a quick note of affirmation. We may not be together in the same place, but we can still get the energy going. Should you experience any technical issues, please send a direct chat to the Grand Rapids Chamber. It will be listed in the chat room. A member of our staff is standing by, ready to assist. Without further ado, please help me in welcome David Paterson, 55th Governor of New York. Before becoming governor, Paterson served New York in a variety of roles, including state senator, secretary of state, duty mayor of New York City, and lieutenant governor. Paterson released his first book in 2020, titled Black, Blind, and in Charge. It tells the story of how he overcame his disability and racial prejudice to become the first blind governor of any state and the fourth African-American governor in US history. Thank you for joining us today, Governor Paterson. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dante, and to Emily and Chantel and all of you who helped organize this today, and to all the sponsors who were able to provide the resources to make this event happen. Thank you so much. And it's so interesting how the Chamber of Commerce in Grand Rapids and other places are helping businesses, particularly the one-stop shop sort of area where you have the assistants trying to raise capital. And maybe the more challenging issue these days, even more challenging than raising capital, is acquiring talent. And I read all about all of the efforts that you've made to make it easier out there in the great state of Michigan. And thank you so much for having me. Well, I started out as a child, just like everybody else. And I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And when I became school age, the New York City public school system told my mother that they were not going to put a blind student, a disabled student, in with the rest of the class. They would send me to a special school for the blind. Years later, my mother would tell me that whoever you go to school with is inevitably going to be who you socialize with, and eventually going to be who you work with. And that if you're depriving yourself of those opportunities, you're starting out behind everyone else. So my mother was a real trailblazer. And so she looked around in New York, and she went to other states. She went to New Jersey and Connecticut. She went to Westchester, north of New York City. And then she went to Long Island, a place called Hempstead, Long Island, where they were probably the second or third best school district in the state. And they informed my mother that they had put disabled students in the classroom with the other children, and that if she would move the family to Hempstead, that they would accommodate me. Now, my father was trying to start a political career in New York City. He was actually the one who was deputy mayor, not me. So I don't want him haunting me about any misrepresentations on my part. But I went to school with the other students in Hempstead, and it was a tremendous experience for me. And I think it was a tremendous experience for the teachers and for them. There were high points and low points. There was a teacher that decided she could not teach me cursive writing because I couldn't see it on the board. And I actually went half of a year not learning it, and really did not learn cursive writing until I was an adult because of this teacher. And my mother finally figured out that she wasn't teaching me. And my mother was also a third grade teacher. So she went up and gave the school a hard time. And this was just one of the obstacles that was in my way at that particular time. I was able to graduate high school early. This is a school that, wasn't sure whether or not they wanted to let me in. And then I went on to Columbia University, and I was on the dean's list at Columbia University between my sophomore and junior year. And I kept going to school during the summer because all my other friends found jobs and I never had one. And so I was going to go to school that summer of 1973, to try to get out of Columbia early. And was at a barbecue, and one of my teachers, who was a special education teacher, so she helped the other teachers conform to having me in the classroom. Her husband said to me that he wanted to round up 15 young people to work in a catering service for day camps during the summer. And would I go out and find him 15 people? Well, I found him 14 people and put my name on the list, and then he didn't hire me. And it's interesting how maybe shielded I was from that kind of an experience, because when that happened, I had an adult conversation with my parents for the first time. It wasn't about coming home late or not cleaning up my room. It was about their inability to understand that he didn't think that I could put an apple and a sandwich in a box and close it and, give it to children for lunch. And finally, my parents kind of did get that, and they let it be known in the neighborhood that they didn't like the way he treated me. And that's when he put the final knife in my heart. He hired my brother, who was underage. And so basically, he violated the law twice. First, he discriminated against somebody, and then he hired an underage person to cover it up. So I go back to school in the fall of 1973, and I couldn't pick up a book. And I think if this kind of thing happened to a young person now, you would send them to counseling or something. But back in those days, any interaction with any sort of psychiatric or psychological counseling would probably inure to the detriment of somebody in their professional career. It's sad, but it's true. So when this happens, the dean, you would think the dean would say, "What happened to you?" He just yelled at me about how I was the first student in the history of Columbia University and King's College to go from the dean's list to flunking out of the school. And so I went to talk to a professor who taught a course called Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And when I told the professor the story, he showed me a picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt being carried into the 1932 Democratic National Convention, where he would receive the nomination to become president. And although I couldn't see his face that well, could see in the picture that they were carrying him. And the teacher said to me, if you could read the expression on his face, he is very angry. And the reason he's angry is that he practiced in the executive mansion of New York, where he was governor, in the pool day after day. And he got to the point where he could walk about 100 feet. And what he wanted to do was to accept the nomination by walking in, because the notion of him being on film in a wheelchair might cause him to lose the election. That's how the disabled were treated in the 1930s. The professor then turned to me and he said to me, you see, David, I feel bad for you. Your parents didn't stick up for you. The woman who was the special education teacher who lived right in the home with the man didn't speak up for you. The people who got the jobs didn't speak up for you. And your brother took the job that you were supposed to have, but at no point did you speak up for yourself. He said, why didn't you put a sign on that building and saying this organization discriminates against the blind, and then call the local newspaper? He said, I'll bet you would have gotten a reaction if you'd done that. And the professor went to the dean's office at Columbia. He convinced him to wipe my whole semester out like I was never there. He told me, we're not going to give you your money back, but you can come back here in a year. And I asked him, where should I be going for a year? He said, well, you're looking for, you want to work right now. That's the priority in your life. Go find a job. And I did go find a job, and I came back to Columbia a year later. And the stone that the builder refused became the governor of the state of New York. And when that professor showed me the picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt going into the 1932 convention, the furthest thought from my mind is that one day I would swim in the pool that President Roosevelt did in the executive mansion. So it's been a, very interesting period, that I've had the opportunity to experience these issues. When we were talking, when I was talking last week to Emily and Chantel, they asked me about the issues of discrimination. And the worst discrimination I ever felt was actually from people who should have understood. So for instance, this gentleman was the vice president of the Nassau County NAACP. And what he did to me was what was done to many African Americans time and time again, but he couldn't see it when the discrimination was coming in a different form. Similarly, I got on the national board of the American Foundation for the Blind. That was probably the most famous organization that serviced blind people. And when I was on the organization in 2004, the chair was going to step down. And no one on the board seemed to want to be the chair. So I told a friend of mine who asked me to join the board, Glenna Michaels, that I'd be willing to be the chair. She was ecstatic. And she went to talk to the executive director about it. And the executive director said, no way. This organization is not ready to have a blind chair, a black chair of the board. Well, in 2004, the American Foundation for the Blind didn't want to have a black chair of the board. But in 2008, America had a black president because they elected him. And I don't think I ever felt so diminished as when he actually said that. When I had to resign from all the boards I was on during the time I was lieutenant governor and governor, and I came back, and he invited me to come back on the board, and I told him exactly why I wasn't going to come back on the board. And neither he and I could see each other, but I'm sure he turned red. So when we think about creating diversity and we think about equity, there's so many interesting ancillary issues that impinge upon that concept. And one of them is one that I learned very recently, and it had to do with hiring on the executive levels in companies and corporations. In that, what is the standard is you interview a few people, and then the people are going to make the decision, sit around and and they say, does anybody know anyone that knows any of these people? Could you go back and do a little research to see what we can find out about these particular people? And what happens is you're automatically discriminating against some of the people because the larger number of people that are in the executive positions are different than those who might be applying. So you may not know anybody who they ever worked with, especially since this kind of process, actually, it may not be intended to be, but it eliminates a lot of candidates who otherwise would have been better. And I understand the human feeling of you call up a friend, oh, I remember her, I worked with her, she was fantastic. You all should take her while she's still available. That's okay. But if the individual who is individuals are applying for a job basically get treated differently because they're not in the network of people who've done that job before, you don't have inclusion. That's why in DEI, inclusion may actually be the most important word. Because I think at this point, when we think about the whole area, we have got to perhaps find some of these interesting sort of dynamics that in some respects infringe upon our ability to achieve it. When I became governor of the state of New York State's procurement was 46th in the country. You would think that many African Americans moved from the South to New York in the 40s and 50s seeking opportunity. And in those days, perhaps they got it. But in terms of the state giving business to companies, we were behind the state of Mississippi. And the state of Mississippi had a governor named Haley Barbour. I actually became friends with him in the National Governors Association. And I used to crack jokes about him, which weren't really what his personality was. But I used to say, Governor Barbour might not want you to live on his block, but he'll give you a contract quicker than you can get one in New York, because it was actually true. So what I basically did was I followed the format that I think we not only can follow in terms of creating racial inclusion, but also for the disabled, also for immigrants, also for people of different ethnicities that aren't getting a fair chance, is you have to recognize that the best way to make change is strong leadership from the executive levels. So Maynard Jackson, who was the mayor of Atlanta for a number of years, he died in 2003. He wanted to build an airport in Atlanta. He wanted to rebuild the Atlanta airport, and he thought it would be a great opportunity to have an African American be the lead engineer. So he told his staff to please go and find one. They came back in 2 weeks. They said, we didn't find one, but we found some great people you can pick from this list. And he said, somewhere in this country there's an African American that knows how to do this. And you all need to find them. And if you don't, in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to find someone to do your job, because maybe they can find them. Well, all of a sudden, they found the gentleman who had built the airport in Portland, Oregon. And he jumped at the chance, moved to Atlanta, and he was the lead engineer in the project. So sometimes, if government really wants to change things, you basically have to have some fair but disciplined processes to create those opportunities. And in terms of the work that we were able to do, we raised the women were 29.2% of those companies, women-owned companies. They were 29.2% of those that were certified to do business in the state of New York, and they got 2.3% of the contracts. Can you believe that? They got 1/10, only 1/10 of them got a contract, because that wasn't necessarily anti-woman sentiment. It was just allowing the institution to govern as opposed to the government, that the institutional procedures never changed. African Americans were 7% of those that were certified and got 1% of the contract, and Hispanics were actually 9% of those that were certified and got 0.75. That's 0.75% of the contracts. When we changed the system, it was the easiest thing I ever did. All we had to do was go back and trace who was still working for the money and who was still receiving money, even though the companies had closed down, the owners had died, and their children were taking the money as if the company was still running. Once we cleaned all of that misuse of public funds out, we were able to create an equal opportunity for everyone. In terms of just where we are as a country and trying to bridge some of the issues in our past that have in many ways inured to our detriment as we've tried to move forward and create equal opportunity. Excuse me one second. We can really start to look at some very positive change in a lot of different places and a greater sense of understanding of the difficulties that people have in these particular areas. And so that's why this kind of a forum this morning is terrific, because it gives us a chance to exchange ideas and opinions about these types of situations, and also to recognize that the inclusion of the most people who have the skills and training to become part of the decision-making capacities in companies and businesses and schools and hospitals and unions, and even in the faith-based community, are essential to the development of our country. And right now is a time when people kind of feel badly about the country. There's a great deal of acrimony. We're at odds with each other. Some people can't sit in the same room without wanting to fight when they have conversations. But if we really think about it, in 1917, when they started the basic IQ tests, an 8th grade student in today's world could get the highest scores on the 1917 IQ test. So that's how advanced we've become in 104 years in terms of the development of talent. We have immense opportunities when you really think about it. We look back on the past as if everything was perfect. Back in the 1600s, we believe that the indigenous community, the Native Americans who lived here, lived in peace. This was a very violent country. The tribes were fighting each other and doing all the things that we do in the world today. And yet, our ability to decrease that amount of violence between countries, as there was between different tribes of people years ago, is monumental. No one ever really thinks about it. We have an incident in Afghanistan. It was horrible, but there were incidents like that almost every week, hundreds of years ago. So our development as a human species has been something to marvel at. And this is what we're trying to perform. This is what we're trying to perform as well. When I was the governor of New York State, we really attempted to do that as much as we could. But this one story I just have to share with you. One day I was coming out of a meeting on minority and women's business opportunities and diversity and equity in state government. And these two gentlemen came up to me, and it was snowing. And the snow was coming down, and I'm getting ready to get in the car to go to the airport. And they said, "Governor, we could just have a word with you. How do we get into the MWBE program?" Now, I know I have severely limited vision, and I know that white snow was falling all over the place, but I thought I could distinctly notice that these were two white men. And I said, well, this is designed for minority companies and women-owned businesses that have been traditionally extracted from the protocol and the procurement policy of New York. And they said, but we live in upstate New York. Your Empire State Development Corporation doesn't think that New York goes beyond Westchester. We never get anything out of the state for our economic development. So I went back and asked some of my staff to look into it, and they turned out to be exactly right. And so I had to start a small business development project to get the companies in upstate New York, no matter what race they were run by, no matter what nationality they had, no matter what sex they were, to get a fair deal from New York. And I wouldn't have known it unless those two gentlemen stopped me when I was on my way to my car at some point. So it was, as hard as we try, sometimes we still come up short, but as long as we are able to understand each other, well, we can work it out. I would close by just telling you this story. I was in Israel in 2007, and I was there with an organization, and we had different speakers come in, and this Palestinian professor came in, and he gave a really great speech. And so my assistant and I contacted him, and we went and had a lunch with him. And he started talking about the Israeli government and they did this and they did that and the Intifada in 2000 and all these different things that they did. And I said, well, why do you think they do that? And he said, because they're sick. Well, I kind of would have expected that answer from him. So then I said to him, but what about September 11th? And what about the attacks on the Golan Heights? And what about the rockets that get fired from Hamas every day? And he looked at me and he said, well, that's because we are sick. And he said, whenever there's great conflict between different groups of people, inevitably, both of them will suffer from a psychological illness that impairs them from really learning how to work together. And I sat there in stunned disbelief that this gentleman was more than willing to take all responsibility for what his peoples had done, in addition to criticizing perhaps what our peoples had done. And I thought that it gave me a whole new perspective on life, that really what we've got to do is find out what it is about little children that they don't have these feelings and try to prevent them from going down roads that are very destructive for human interaction. So thank you for having me as a speaker this morning. It's been a real opportunity, and I'm sure we'll have some questions, and I might even be willing to answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Governor Paterson. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your insights, some of your experiences as a leader in the state of New York. You're a wonderful storyteller, and we believe in the power of telling stories. So thank you for sharing some of your stories as well. We heard a lot of really great conversational points, ones that I just kind of jotted down and want to highlight. You really reiterated the importance of inclusion in the DEI conversation. So I love that you brought into the conversation inclusion. You spoke about systems and how we have to look at the greater systems that exist. You highlighted supplier diversity, which is something that we find very important in a lot of the conversations we have with our businesses and members. Minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and then you also talked about the things that can happen when implicit bias comes into play when we're talking about recruiting and hiring of folks, and kind of that affinity bias that we can sometimes find present in the hiring practices. So thanks for highlighting some of the things that you've done to tackle some of those challenges. So I'm just going to run into a few questions, and the first one that I can think of here is, that you represent the beauty of intersectionality, of a person being a person of color and a person with a disability. How have those identities shaped and influenced the way that you choose to lead?
Well, when I was talking about my biggest feeling of being separated out, or my biggest feeling of being rejected, it was from people who I thought should have known better. Here we are fighting for the blind, and this guy says that because I'm African American, I can't be chair of the national organization of the American Foundation for the Blind. And then, of course, the gentleman who wouldn't hire me to, pack lunches, and then he further impacted on it by politically trying to make it up to my family by hiring my sibling. In what I think it enabled me to understand at a greater level than most people could, not because they didn't have the ability, but they just didn't have the experience, is just the universality of life, that we are all born with little inherent prejudices, and we have to fight them. Now, everybody says that they're not prejudiced, and everybody says that they don't think about race, and everybody says they don't think about this and that. But the reality is that we all do. We would all agree that we hated Hitler, but we all have little biases that we have from time to time, and we should be aware of that. And I think we should be aware of that not so much to try to create shame, but to just understand that that's the way that human beings are. We're all basically the same. We're all basically alike. These differences that we feel are physical. They're color, or national origin, or sexual preference, or economic standing. And they, in the end, are all going to go away when we go away. But the only thing that we have while we're here is the opportunity to expand the capacity of the human race to develop. So, we all come here in very vulnerable situations. We're babies. We're unarmed. And yet there have been so many people who have taken the first steps down new roads armed by nothing but their own vision, and have changed the world. And the invitation to us is to try to utilize our abilities and even disabilities, because I always found that when I went and spoke to young people, and I was a young person, these people would come in, we'd have a school assembly and they would speak and they seemed perfect. And the teachers said they were perfect and they lectured us and that kind of thing. But when I became the person that would go to speak to young people, I would first tell them about my problems and the situations they went through. I think they could relate to that a little better. And so that's how I was able to use perhaps some of the unhappier moments of my life to perhaps give some perspective that would not make those moments equally unhappy for the next generation.
I love that. That's an example of being a little bit vulnerable and empathetic and leading in that capacity. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown, so she would probably be jumping up and down with that. So just standing up in front of folks and saying, look, here's my story, here are my pain points, I'm not perfect. That can be pretty helpful to people in this conversation. So thank you for that insight.
Oh, you have to be able to do that. When I went back, they gave me a special award some years ago at Columbia University. And of course, I left the school and didn't come back, for a few years. And
Right.
they said, oh, he was a wonderful student. And that's not exactly how it started that way, but that's not exactly how it worked out. So when it was my turn to speak, I told them that a dean once said to me, when you leave, close the door behind you.
Yeah. Well, I think you made up for it, sir. You did a great job, and you've done wonderful things. I have a couple of questions coming into us from the chat. So this is from the audience who's watching you right now. So I wanted to highlight the question from Shayla. How can non-executive staff advocate for inclusive hiring and recruiting when their company generally hires from referrals? Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Well, that's kind of an institutional process where the DEI concepts have not made their way to the headhunters. That's basically the obstacle in these types of situations. I think that perhaps depending upon, and you don't always get this, but the ability of management to sit down with those under them. I saw a survey that at the 14 levels of corporations, each one thought that the one below them loved them. Of course they'd feel that way because nobody really tells them how they feel or what's going on. So I think in these types of situations, some of the internal organizations could meet and try to pick out the people who are in management to approach and have these conversations, because you can refer things out, you can refer new job openings out. Some company comes in, brings you a set of candidates. They're all basically the same candidate from different people. You haven't done anything to really expand the process, and then go home and really think that you are creating fairness. And there are many people in management who manage others who don't want to hear that something is unfair because they take it personally. They think that they personally are discriminating against people, and they're actually not. What they are is antiquated. They don't understand the new ways to try to find talent and the new places where talent has existed for a long time and no one has ever tried to access it. And so it's not an easy thing to do. It's a very incisive question. But I do think that inevitably there's usually a couple of people that are open to the conversation, or particularly when companies have these special days for Columbus Day or Martin Luther King's birthday or Black History Month or Women's History Month or Hispanic History Month, where in those programs the message can be sent by the outside speakers who come in. And so I've been able to take advantage of that at the time. I could speak to management because they couldn't do anything to me. And it would never occur to them that I got my information from their own employees.
That's very good insight. So that kind of speaks to something that you touched on earlier, the importance of executive commitment and kind of the top-down approach of looking at DEI and embedding it within an organization. Would you be willing to share maybe a few examples of ways that you did that as governor from a top-down approach?
Well, I issued an executive order that I wanted the numbers of contracts to be diversified among groups. And that was my condition for running for lieutenant governor with the governor, who was Elliot Spitzer. I told him I wanted him to do that. When we got in office, he didn't do that. And it was very embarrassing because a year after I got in as lieutenant governor, I thought, maybe I shouldn't have done this because I can't deliver this. Then, unfortunately for the governor, he had to resign. And the kind of pompous, condescending attitude that I got from, some of his commissioners about the subject. Now I'm the governor. And one of the issues about government is that when there's a new government, nobody has any right to a job. So in other words, when the first time I spoke in front of the 200 people who worked in the executive branch. None of them had employment, beyond that day, theoretically. So when I came in, I got this spontaneous, resounding applause. And I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, I'm getting an applause because these people don't want to lose their jobs. So I actually said, listen, we're going to make some changes, but we don't have to make drastic changes. Is everybody here, do you feel that you're following the oath that you took to work here? Yes. Do you feel that you're following the provisions of the constitutions of the state of New York? And they said, yes. And I said, whatever happened to my MWBE program? Well, you would have thought that someone had thrown a firecracker into the audience, the way people they were calling up people to try to get them in to help before I was actually even sworn in as governor. So what I'm saying is that you're not a tyrant, but you can take advantage of the fact that you're in charge to get people to realize what your goals are and your timetables to reach those goals. And you can do something that would really change everything for the procurement. And as I said, when we actually changed it, we found that we didn't have to really get rid of that many groups. There were just so many that shouldn't have been there after years of recycling contracts. And sometimes they weren't even doing any work. So that's what I mean by using the power of strong leadership from the executive levels, because if you do a wink and a nod, as the governor before me did, nothing's going to change.
Great, thank you for your response. I've got another question from the audience. This one is an anonymous. So for those of us that are in recruiting, how can we best partner with disability advocates to bring those candidates with disabilities into the process, i.e. applications, interviews, onboarding, etc.?
Well, just the fact that you want to do it is the first step. So you're 50% there just by the fact that there's interest. Sometimes some of the advocacy groups become very political themselves because they miss the step that we're not just hiring people so we can check a box and say we have them. We're hiring people with the idea that they're not only going to be people who would have been hired if they didn't have disabilities, but the fact that they may have them may expand the total perceptions and knowledge of the company itself. That, in other words, that they will be a welcomed addition because their experiences can be very helpful in trying to, recruit. It's one of the things that that I think the advocacy groups could do a little better is to assemble the names of people that have the capacity and the educational ability to serve, particularly with the blind. The average blind person in this country has achieved 3% higher than the average student. So in other words, as students, blind people have gone further than others, but we still have something like a 60% unemployment rate in the blind community because we've learned how to educate people who are blind, but we haven't learned how to use them in the workplace. And particularly now with the large number of young people who are on the spectrum, it's good to see that a lot of advocacy groups are setting up situations because young people on the spectrum, they may have trouble writing, they may have trouble reading, but there are a lot of jobs that they can actually do. And it changes their self-esteem. It makes their families proud of them. And we're starting to extend those opportunities. I think that businesses are now more inclined to do that because unlike 50 or 60 years ago, almost everybody knows someone who has some disability of one kind or another. So the access is greater because the internal understanding has been heightened by experience.
Excellent. Thank you for your comments there. And we had somebody in the chat from the Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired just reach out and say, please connect with us. So doing good work in the chat here, wanting to be helpful and walk alongside folks as they're in the recruiting process. So thank you for your insights. Appreciate that. And I read an article one time about one other form of diversity, which can be neurodiversity, right? And sometimes folks who have autism or different issues that normally don't look positive in a hiring practice can be actually highly beneficial to certain organizations within certain roles. So it's really important to take a look at all the different aspects of diversity, including disabilities. So another quick question. If you are hiring, oh, nope, we got Marcus Manders is putting his information in there for folks to reach out to him for the Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired. So there you go, making connections. So when we're thinking about this being the National Employment Disability Awareness Month, what might be some of the things that you're most proud of during your tenure as governor as it relates to being visually impaired? And likewise, as it relates to you being the first African-American governor of New York?
Well, I was very happy that a lot of the trades issues, there are a lot of blind people who run their own businesses. Some of them are street merchants, some of them are just working in the whole trades area, that we were able to help them. But I have a regret, which is that I should have put DBE in with M and WBE. And I think that I thought we were doing it, but found out when I left that we hadn't done it, that it kind of got pushed to the back burner and then kind of ignored by the next administration. So that was when I went to work for the National Federation of the Blind, who is one of the more aggressive disability rights organizations. And I'm really happier about the work I did for them than I actually did as governor. There are, 2 or 3 things that I've kicked myself about since I left. That would be one of them.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. That'd be interesting to learn more about your role on the board. So maybe that's another conversation that we can have with you. So what were some of the biggest unforeseen bias-based challenges that you faced when you became a governor, and how did you overcome those?
I think it's sort of interesting if you go and take a look at New York has a new governor, and she has become governor for about 2 months now. And prior to being governor, she was lieutenant governor, but prior to being that, she was the city clerk in Buffalo. So she kind of came from out of nowhere to be governor. Now, before I became governor, I was the first non-white man or woman to become a legislative leader in New York. Had I not become governor, I was within 2 votes of becoming the first African-American majority leader of the New York State Senate, which is really the second most powerful position in government to the governor. The lieutenant governor sits around waiting for plane crashes, or if the governor chokes at dinner, you can perform the fake Heimlich maneuver where you pretend to help him, then he doesn't make it, and now you're a governor. So what I'm really saying is just that I had been in the legislature for 21 years. I had written some of the real change agent type legislation, like hate crimes, child sexual abuse legislation, legislation regarding disabilities. So I had a pretty good portfolio. But in the first month that I was governor, they gave me this nickname, the accidental governor. And I want to know what the accident was. I was lieutenant governor. The Constitution says when the governor leaves, lieutenant governor assumes the role as governor. I don't see what the accident was. Nobody called President Johnson the accidental president after he succeeded President Kennedy. And no one called a gentleman named Wilson the accidental governor when he succeeded Governor Rockefeller when he became vice president. So I thought that in many respects, the media took a direct way of attacking me time and time again, really based on race and probably even more so on disability. So for instance, I made a speech once that I said that we will be building at the World Trade Center. And I knew we had started building, but the area where the terrible attack on America came in 2001 was vacant when I became governor, and we were starting to build. And I said, we're going to be building, we're going to build something. And they wrote this article out. Someone should take Governor Paterson down and let him touch the buildings because he doesn't seem to know that they've already started building yet. These references to my eyesight were pretty cruel and pretty nasty. And then, of course, I got portrayed as a Mr. Magoo jerk on Saturday Night Live by Fred Armisen for 2 years. They had this skit of me bumping into walls and holding maps upside down. And I actually did hold a map upside down once. But the point is that it was designed to make me appear to be not serious or you know, whatever. I spent a weekend with my parents in the Hamptons, which is the Eastern Long Island, New York. People like to go there during the summer. The media said that we don't know where he is, but we think that he's at Puff Daddy's house. I didn't even know Puff Daddy, but it was just designed to make someone look not serious. And I think I cannot say that I wasn't hurt personally. It reminded me of being cajoled on the playground when I was a kid. But finally, I have a great friend. His name is Jeff Green, and it was about 3 months before I was leaving office. And he said, look, David, you fought the fight. You did the right thing. He said, but Saturday Night Live keeps asking you to come on. And if you come on, no one's ever going to forget that you were there. Go on there and give it back to them. And so I went on Saturday Night Live and I spoke to them and I said, you all made so much fun of me for being blind that I forgot I was Black.
You had the last word there, huh? And then
absolutely. That episode was shown 5 times, which is tied for the most Saturday Night Live repeats. So I have a little place in Saturday Night Live history.
Well, you have a broad and vast experience as a leader and leading with lived experiences and empathy and creating inclusive opportunities for the folks that you lead. Thank you for sharing so many of your insights about best practices as it relates to recruiting and you know, using that empathetic and vulnerable approach and leading with fairness and equity. So we appreciate you being here today. Thank you all for tuning in. Please join us in one more round of virtual applause for Governor Paterson for being here. We thank you. Thank you.
By the way, I'll close by telling you something that happened on my last day as governor. My last day as governor, they asked me to come in my office, and I came in the office and there was something on the top of my desk, and I thought it was a cake, like we were going to celebrate that I was governor, but it wasn't a cake. It was a box of lunch boxes and sandwiches, and they had sandwiches there, and they had, and they said to me, we'd like to see you pack these lunch boxes because you've told that story about your childhood so much. We really want to know if you can pack a lunch, because if you can, we have a job for you when you leave office.
That's excellent. And I'm sure you packed those lunches like amazingly well, right? Oh my goodness, you're getting lots of thanks in the chat. Thank you also to our sponsors. We are deeply appreciative of your support today. I'd also like to take the opportunity to introduce our new Director of Inclusion, Andre Daly. Andre is actually a native New Yorker like Governor Paterson. Andre comes to the chamber with extensive experience in the DEI space, and we're thrilled to have him join our team. Welcome, Andre. Before we depart, I'd like to highlight a few chamber happenings. The 11th annual Epic Awards Gala is next Monday, the 25th. This year, we have 3 new DEI recognitions. Registration closes soon, so get yours today. You apply today, or I'm sorry, register today. The link is in the chat. Also, keep an eye out for our November 16th DEI Summit. It's going to be amazing. Look on our website for that as well. A complete list of our diversity, equity, and inclusion services can be found on the Chamber website. If your organization has an interest in beginning or furthering its DEI journey, please contact myself or Andre or Dante. All of our emails are in the chat. And last, you'll receive a survey following today's event asking you to rate your overall experience, 1 being the lowest possible score and 10 being the highest. Your feedback's very important to us. So it allows us to enhance our programs from month to month and year to year. So please take a few moments to complete that survey. Be well, have a wonderful and inclusive week. And thank you again, Governor Paterson. Have a great day.